Adrian has a chair in sociology and social theory at the University of Leeds. He joined the School of Leeds from Sciences Po, where he was a professor of sociology, and he has an extraordinary CV, obviously having worked at Aarhus, as well as at the Department of Sociology at UCLA. Adrian is a well-known expert and scholar on immigration, integration, and citizenship. And he's directing the ESRC-funded Northern Exposure Project. Please have a look at its outputs. He shared them with us already. They look really, really interesting. He's also leading the Bauman Institute and associate of Center for Ethnicity and Racism Studies. Beyond having his remarkable academic interests and achievements, Adrian also has an interest and expertise in art and architecture in Japan, which makes him a lot more interesting to me because I live in Hokkaido. We're very, very happy that he's here with us this morning, and I'd like to welcome him to give us our second keynote. Thank you very much, Adrian.
Thank you, Umut, and yeah, such a nice audience here today with this project. And I'm just going to talk. There's no slides, and I'm kind of throwing out ideas today. So I hope this will have some kind of contribution to the projects that you're involved in. I'm going to pose the same question effectively as Andrea Carla did yesterday to Jenny after her presentation. And why are you calling it integration? What I'm doing effectively is try and challenge some of the illusions of interculturalist integration model building. Are we okay, by the way? Everything okay? I assume.
Yes, it's going well. It's going well. Yeah.
Good. So the focus here is, in a sense, on interculturalism as the most sympathetic model of integration, model building, and the kind of sense that people doing intercultural research and the kinds of, in a sense, the sort of model that we heard about yesterday is somehow exempt from the critique of integration that has become very prominent in the literature. Scholars like Willem Schinkel recently, but also, a critique that really goes back decades. If you go back to critical race studies in the 1960s and the 70s in the US and the UK, the rejection of kind of integration by anti-racist scholars. And even if you go back all the way to something like Du Bois versus Robert Park, this critique has been out there for forever, in a sense. And I also, a lot of my work is influenced by the work of Abdelmalek Sayad, which has been, again, around for decades. It's kind of surprising that we're still on this kind of page, in a sense. Now, I joked with John Fox yesterday that, in relation to Jenny's position, I'm an extremist on integration, and that's what I'm doing today. That's my critique today from an extreme position, and that should leave him plenty of room for a reasonable middle way later. And it'll be interesting to see how our discussion goes next week in the light of this. So obviously, if I put another hat on, I would sympathize with the impact compromises of applied policy research, the pragmatic position that Jenny outlined yesterday. As Umut mentioned, the Northern Exposure Project is all about working with local authorities and, and their sort of discourses of cohesion and inclusion and integration sometimes that we kind of have to work with when you get involved in the impact kind of work. But for this kind of talk, I'm taking a Bourdieusian position. This is a critique of integration. It's not an attempt to reframe it. And a Bourdieusian, of course, is going to start off with the basic point that we should not be blurring our categories of practice with our categories of analysis. We need to work to, in a sense, purify our categories of analysis in order to have autonomous critical research. And I think, there's a huge problem in our field, for effectively the way in which everything we do has got wrapped up with categories of practice, political discourses, and particularly the sorts of constraints that are put on us as we put together impact oriented research and look out for money for such projects. And I do think that refugee studies within migration studies in a broad sense kind of just blundered into the integration discussions you know, from the early 2000s, particularly the sort of Ager and Strang sort of line that's reflected in these integration indicators. Another example in an American context is a recent piece by Donato and Ferris, a scholarship that sort of talks about integration with absolutely no attention to the longer standing literature or these longer standing critiques that were out there all along. And this points to the lack of accumulative knowledge in migration studies and ethnic and racial studies, effectively. You know, I feel like I've been saying these kinds of things really since the late 1990s. There's a report I did for the Carnegie Endowment critiquing integration research in 1999. You can find this on Academia EDU. You know, and that report precisely kind of looks at trying to how impact orientates kind of the demands of our research, the political conceptualizations and the incentives, particularly through funding, that structure research and condition the knowledge that impose conditions or condition knowledge production in some sorts of ways. And you know, I think this is, we have to kind of continue to reflect upon the real problems here. So, for example, in the UK, you can't use the term integration and pretend that the Casey report doesn't exist, right? The Casey report is what all local authority actors refer to immediately when they talk about integration, and it structures nearly all local political understandings of the term. So there's a real issue there, I think, about not addressing that sort of pressure on the research. Now, so the best defense that I think that can be made for you know, a reframing kind of integration model of the kind that Jenny presented yesterday is that, you know, okay, just give us a break on this critique. We've changed the language so that we could receive the tender, so that we could do the research and occupy the policy space. And what we're studying, of course, is what we used to call multiculturalism. We call it integration now because that's the kind of dominant debate. It used to be multiculturalism, or it used to be talked about in the terms that we used to use in the 1990s, like cosmopolitanism, diaspora, transnationalism, conviviality, the kinds of things that have become increasingly discredited idealisms of the 1990s, you know, the era of mobility and cosmopolitan type thinking in some sense. But the problem here is, of course, is that we're then adapting our academic research to a language that has shifted so far to the right that we're now debating effectively on Farageist or, you know, what I think is ultimately Powellian, you know, territory, the territory defined in some sense by the debates that go back to Enoch Powell in the 1960s that Farage mobilized very successfully for the Brexit vote. You know, and that we're kind of stuck in that space if we don't sort of define a critical position outside of this particular sort of what is, you know, the Johnsonian politics of the present in the UK. Now, the case for intercultural integration, for the interculturalist models of integration, which are, you know, still hugely popular, and there's all kinds of research that work we could cite internationally across Europe. It's a defining characteristic, I think, of lots of the funding that has come out after the refugee crisis, 2015 and so forth, and the money that's gone into integration since then. So this kind of research shifts to the local. It prioritizes mutual recognition, everyday interaction, multidimensional networks and sectors in which different kinds of integration maybe are happening, variable outcomes, and it argues that it's all about the process and not the linear endpoint that is supposedly characteristic of normative ideas of kind of national integration. It's an aspirational model, as we heard, and then has the practical kind of measurements and toolkits and so on for measuring integration effectively from the migrant's point of view. And this is some of the things that people stress, I think, in trying to defend this position, that it's okay as long as the migrant, in a sense, reports feeling integrated with someone somewhere in our society. You know, integration is somehow happening, albeit in these particular pockets of local interactions. Now, what I would say about this is that this is not a theory of society. It's not really a sociological way of looking at integration. Integration, in a theoretical sense, has to be thought of in Durkheimian sense, and the Durkheimian sense of integration is a theory which talks about the theory of society, how society individuates number one, how it unifies society, binds it together, gives it common values, but also how it bounds it, how it creates a boundary around that society, how it creates a particular sort of scale to society and social interaction. So integration then is a property of a social system. It's not something that migrants hold or carry. And the fact that a migrant feels integrated does not mean they are in fact integrated. You know, it's something to do with the system as a whole, and we have to think about it as a whole, which is why the nation, you know, is the typical kind of level we think about integration. A person who's not integrated is not a disintegrated person, for example. What they are is someone who is disintegrating the system, potentially. That is, that whose lack of integration is causing a certain sort of disintegration in the system. And this can be a good thing. This can maybe be a good thing if it's a conflictual kind of response to the pressures of integration. Not all consensual systems are just or defensible. And this is the point I just made to Umut, really, about consensus versus conflict in society. And the fundamental idea, the fundamental function of integration in our societies is actually selecting out particular foreigners for the immigration process. It's how our societies deal with foreigners in a very selective way, and select out particular kind of foreigners who are immigrants in that society, and other foreigners who are not immigrants in that society. Now, part of this is, of course, first rejecting those foreigners who are not part of our society, that is aliens. It's about maintaining the border to foreigners who are outside British society, let's say. It's also about defining foreigners who are not integratable. So it's about marginalizing and excluding from the integration process illegal migrants, for example, or illegal populations, which I think is an interesting question. They only become integratable once they are legal, effectively, which is the debates around that status in some sense in society. This is also, of course, where the ethno-cultural stuff comes into integration, because there are all these debates about certain forms of culture and certain sorts of behavior not being integratable at this point. But I think what's distinctive about my argument generally about integration, and which I think is in a sense more important than these more obvious ways in which integration works, is that integration is how society renders invisible those who are part of our society and economy, but who are not integrated. These are the foreigners, the massive numbers of foreigners who participate in our society, who come as tourists, as visitors, but also as non-nationals present in the society, but who are simply just mobile people. They're people who are able to be in our society, but who are not subject to integration in the same sort of way. And these, I mean, the EU citizens in Britain used to be like this until we started calling them immigrants as a result of Brexit. But these people are also our own elites. These are the global elites, the national members of our society who can float free from the kinds of pressures and other things that are imposed upon those that are supposed to integrate in our society. So integration is about, in a sense, managing the relationship between people who kind of have to prove that they belong in society, who are members of a society, and those who are unable to really kind of take it in an a la carte way, choose to integrate or be integrated and be members when they want, but choose to also offshore whatever they want whenever they don't want to be part of that society. And you can kind of imagine the kind of people I'm thinking of. Now, this additional function to integration has emerged in the global era. It's the symbolic function of immigrant integration. It's integration for some, which is what this ongoing nation building and nationalism is, which allows the neoliberal mobilities for others. Free movement for others, in other words, for global citizens and global individuals. And this is the main message of my work, is let's not underestimate this as a form of nationalism. This particular kind of solution of integration in the global era is a form of nationalism that is an ongoing form of neo-colonial power in the world. And societies that manage to pull off this particular kind of trick of squaring the circle between national integration and kind of global mobility, if you like, are the most powerful places in the world. Now, what is this integration in its highest possible expression? Now, it's not the ethno-cultural nation. It's not some sort of exclusive ethno-cultural nation that is built around, you know, a white Eurocentric culture, effectively. It's something, it's developed beyond that. It's multiculturalism in one nation. It's something that, or something that Tariq Madood, for example, would defend as multicultural nationalism. Now, nations, you know, nations in this global world, what they're still having to do is distinguish themselves from their environment. It's kind of useful to think of the world out there, you know, the global, the kind of totality of the world in some sense as a sort of an infinite amount of diversity and complexity. And what nations do with integration is differentiate themselves or separate themselves from that world. It's about the reduction of diversity, in other words, or reducing dissonance or complexity in order to have a national society, having a functional national society that works within this wider environment. This is about drawing a border around society politically, putting a box on it, literally, the container box, and we call it democracy, or we call it the people, and then we put a flag on it. And this is where political power and political legitimacy comes from in terms of liberal democracies. So integration is nation building, as it always has been, and it works to resolve the anomaly in a global society of populations crossing borders in a still politically legally speaking, Westphalian type of world. This is the kind of thing you get from reading John Torpey's work on the passport. Yopka often makes these kinds of points. And the challenge that's out there is, of course, the challenge of immigration, challenge of migration generally, mobilities, diversity, and so forth, in this kind of ongoing nationalized world that we live in politically. Now, the highest expression of this, of course, in multiculturalism in one nation is the kind of thing that we saw at the British Olympics in 2012, right? It's the celebrations of British future, the multicultural, multiracial, nominally post-colonial kind of society in which Mo Farah can brandish his gold medals for Britain. And this is where I think my argument maybe annoys or upsets people, because, you know, I also think it's things like Majid and his immigrants make Great Britain great kind of t-shirts. It's Sundar Katwala and his British Future organization having conversations about multicultural, multiracial futures. And it's the Home Office 2019 report, I think. I mean, it's this kind of celebration of a sort of British integratory power. And this is what I call the immigrant integration nation. This is the integration nation as an ideal type. And to be honest, you know, I'm alarmed when I hear that this has been so influential. You know, if it's being picked up all around the world, the Home Office integration indicators and applied all around the world as an integration model, this is a proof, I think, of the ongoing soft power of British colonialism or neo-colonialism in some sense. That Britain is still a model in this sense. But I do think this is fundamentally not a European idea or a Eurocentric idea as such. Well, it's built on the top of Eurocentric coloniality, but it is fundamentally an American idea. It's an idea about the immigrant integration, the immigrant nation as a kind of power built on immigration, and the power to integrate diversity on a global scale. And it's symptomatic of the neo-colonial global order, which is, of course, an American-centered world. And European nations like Britain are kind of chasing after this sort of vision. UK plays a key place in this because it is in a sense one of the other highest expression of this kind of form of colonial power. And in other terms, it's what we call what critical race theorists are calling racial capitalism. It's globalization. And there are other models emerging of this kind of racial capitalism. Brazil, Singapore. I think France is an interesting alternate kind of version in a European context. And other European countries are aspiring to the American model in some ways. So the problem is not that it's an ethno-cultural nation. It's not just about black and brown people are not part of some white Eurocentric nation, but it's a much more difficult kind of Foucauldian proposition that I'm making here. This is the biopower of multiracial integration that is able to encompass the diversity of the world, whether it's multiracial, it's global, it wins gold medals. It's not exactly post-race because it has an interest, there's still a kind of a particular way in which which race is differentiated within this kind of racial capitalism, but it is what we think of as global Britain or the Empire 2.0 project, I think. So I think you know, I'm also saying, you know, another way of saying this is that the 70s problematic of it, there ain't no black in the Union Jack, which I think has kind of come back very strongly with a lot of decolonial discussions at the moment, is not quite what the problem is. I mean, that problem is still with us, but it's more than that. And I think Gilroy and Hall's work in the 1990s points to what I'm saying in certain sorts of ways. It points to the certain issues with the post-race society and conviviality that I think are embodied in this particular form of nationalism that is associated with kind of a multiracial integration. And I would recommend Siva Mohan Vallabhan's argument for something, the clamor of nationalism. I think he's one of the things that he kind of identifies in this excellent book, The Clamor of Nationalism. I mean, this is obviously offering reasons for why I think that the intercultural interaction argument maybe is a little bit naive in some sense in not addressing these kind of fundamental issues, I think, about nationalism that are still out there. Now, the interactionist model, I mean, it's really based on a kind of a resolution, a supposedly sort of resolution that's being effected in local kind of contexts of mutual interaction in society that is resolving, of course, centuries of discussion about the phenomenological problematic of Hegel, the Hegelian master-slave type of dialectic. And in philosophy, this really has got as far as Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, in which, of course, the universal presence of the negatory race differentiation is always the condition for the emergence of the human subject, the citizen, the citizen individual. So the race component is still identified in all the kind of decolonial critical race theory as a kind of core component of this production of the resolution of phenomenology in citizenship. You know, and you can read Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics as an extended riff on this kind of thinking. So, I mean, you know, from a critical point of view, we've got the Fanon type of argument, and we know that the historical scar of race still cuts through all of our Enlightenment thinking on this. And it seems unlikely, quite honestly, that intercultural integration models would be exempt from this particular critique, or we continue to need to ask the question, under what conditions would this be the case? But I do think that what's going on with integration, the integration nation argument, is that it works to resolve this sort of issue. It's the way nation-building citizenship models have always worked, through the claim of national inclusion, through the claim of building relations socially across different sorts of groups. People get integrated into into a kind of citizenship that creates a kind of equality at a normative national level, albeit that society is divided in other kinds of ways. It's how working class gender inequalities have been included. It's how the welfare state was built, and of course, with the external minorities, of course, in the colonies that made that possible. It's how the post-colonial shrinkage of the nation to a territorial state has been possible in the post-colonial era, and it's eventually how immigrants are going to be integrated into our global system. It's a system. But of course, this then brings us to the integration into what question, given that this is the kind of process that's still going on in our national society. And of course, the integration into what question is about the deeply divided, conflictual, and polarized society that the integration is taking place into. It's a polity of political conflict in which integration is a kind of a reparative discourse that has moved, in recent times, has moved from a kind of discourse of classlessness in some sense, about how our society is integrative because it's become a classless society, to something now which is being projected onto the integration, the kind of core integration of our society is a fiction of the working class in some sense. It's the new nationalized working class that's being identified as the native so-called indigenous population who are integrated, and where integration is now being applied as a kind of leveling up in national politics of that class. Now, the problem here, of course, the initial problem here is the supposed integration of new minorities in very marginal positions to this fictionalized working class, which is the anchor of the nation. And integration models typically are working on this sort of level. They're working, in localities where we're imagining our migrants integrating into this particular sort of indigenous population. But we of course know when we look closely at how this particular sort of idea of British integration is being constructed in the current kind of Johnsonian discourse. It's a simulacra of a working class, of course. And I'm talking, of course, the influence of scholars like Paul Collier, Eric Kaufman, David Goodhart, Matthew Goodwin, and so forth. But of course, in a divided, conflictual, deeply polarized society, the working class is not what any one of these scholars is imagining it. It is, of course, something that's more like a kind of underclass, as it used to be told. It's a peripheral, unemployed, aged, on benefits, single mother or asylum seeker type working class at the bottom of end of society. And the problem of imagining integration in relation to that is an initial issue. Integration, if it's happening at a local level, if it's not that, it's often an integration imagined into the existing British Black and minority ethnic populations, who we know are also not equal or integrated in our society. This, I think that this has become very clear, I think, with the attempt of the Commission of Race and Ethnicity report, in some sense, to try and kind of whitewash out or average out these kinds of the obvious inequalities that exist on this level, but which is often, in other sorts of discourses, this is being pointed to as the great achievement, in some sense, of multiracial, multicultural Britain. That is, that it has built a kind of multiracial society that is integrating its BME populations. Now, integration into that, I think, would be a kind of segmented assimilation, perhaps, or what John refers to as pathological integration. It's not an integration into something that really in any way resembles an integrated society. But even if we take things like employment as the kind of measure for this, and this point has been made a couple of times, I think, already in our discussions, that integration into employment is often integration into the particular kinds of 3D work that are associated with minority populations or marginal populations in our society, the dirty, dangerous, dull, and in fact diseased during COVID jobs that we find in low-end service, logistics, deliveries, construction, and public sector care work. So, a lot of integration is integration into that. And that would be seen, I think, according to a lot of measures, as a kind of positive integration. I've mentioned how, a third dimension of this kind of integration, what question is, of course, the functional way in which it lets other people float free. That is, we fictionalize integration as an integration into a statistically homogenized mainstream, when in fact we have deep race and class differentiation, which is linked to those that integrate at a national scale, while others are able to kind of, as it were, integrate into a global kind of society. So, Boris Johnson is at home wherever he wants in the world. He will never have to take an integration test or prove that he's integrated in that sense. Michael Gove will never be bound by the same national curriculum that he forces on working class kids. They can go off to listen to the opera in Beirut in Germany or whatever, have their cake and eat it, in other words, because they're part of global elites and they're not part of, they're not subject to the same sort of integration that others in our society are subject to. And then, of course, you get a fourth dimension of this is a sort of identification then of particular sorts of integrated individuals as success stories. So the Priti Patel or Rishi Sunak type of sort of a member of the global elite that is proof of British diversity and so forth. this is a kind of integration as an individualizing, extractive and nation branding type of integration process. And this, I think, becomes the model for asylum seekers and national and model minorities in many senses within our integration models. And here I think we need to start thinking a bit about, all of the focus in integration is always on the trajectories and things that are happening to migrant and minority populations as they find a place as newcomers or whatever in our society. But there's always the issue of who it leaves behind. There's the transnational kind of question, and who is left behind literally by this sort of this linear process is, of course, the people in sending countries who are effectively unable to move in the global system we live in, the wretched of the earth or the subaltern populations with their worthless passports and positions in the societies where they live that prevent them from moving at all. They don't move and can't move. And I think this is a kind of problem for a lot of asylum researchers who are wanting to kind of argue for a sort of unlimited sort of integration for people who are seeking asylum for whatever reasons, because it doesn't include those populations who simply can't move at all, which is one of the features of the world that we live in. So on all of these points, why do we call it integration when what the system is creating is domination? It's creating racialized, minoritized and migranticized populations, and then when it works or when we find evidence for it, we put a flag on it and celebrate it as a sort of success for our society. And my basic argument here is that I think we can do better as researchers than say, well, we're only in it because we need to do these projects, because I think this is how the doxa works. This is how it's reproduced and how academics are part of reproducing a particular sort of domination and mode of thinking about society. Now, what I want to end with, I think, is, of course, picking up, I think, on the talk we had from Umut. I'm not trying to say that the kinds of examples that are being pointed at, either by Umut or in a sense, in many of the kinds of things that Jenny's pointed to in her study, are necessarily bad things. I mean, what we need to be redescribing these as, when they are having effects that are transformative of our society, are denationalizing our society and creating a different sort of society in a global context that is less nationalist and more, in a sense, more inclusive of the diversity that's out there in the world. Is it something that we describe as a disintegration of a national society in some sense, and the terms of integration as it's dominantly understood? And we'd like to be able to sort of find this and know it when we've seen it, and also measure it in some sort of way. And I think, honestly, unless you are David Miller or Paul Collier, I think pretty much everybody in the kind of migration research that we're doing is on board with this in some sense. I mean, we understand the point that are being made from a kind of decolonial or Marxist world systems point of view, and we are all at least cosmopolitans or ideally post-nationalists in some sort of sense. But I do think, as I was suggesting before, I think we have to focus then on not on identifying moments of harmony and consensus building at local levels as necessarily positive things, but only kind of identify them as such when they are also focused on the conflict that they bring to our society, the disintegrative type of effects that they have, that might be expressed through mobilization or solidarity of people who find a common kind of social class position, but also the global politics side of this. It's very important, for example, that we don't celebrate asylum seekers finding a place in our society and finding a kind of identity for themselves, say within British political conflict, if it's not also having some sort of effect on what they've left behind, on the global politics that they should also be part of, because of the transnational dynamics that we often get forgotten, I think, in the integrative process. We need to be able to analytically distinguish when something global, or perhaps better planetary, is happening in the local, as opposed to something that can be branded as British. And I think it's interesting, the Scottish environment, obviously some of these things that are building the Scottish nation are also disintegrative of British society. And that's an interesting politics, I think, that sort of three-way issue. But of course, if Scotland ever becomes independent, it's going to face a problem that all of these things then become kind of nation building in the way that they currently are in the UK as a whole. But we need categories of analysis that are up to this sort of task. The de-differentiation of national society through the presence of non-nationals or not fully nationalized populations. And there's ways in which we could sort of think about this in terms of the, the ongoing effects of various sorts of post-national ideas, I think, within our society. But this is a theory in empirics that goes beyond the normative typologizing, I think, that is familiar from these sorts of intercultural models. Now, I do think that these projects that you're doing are working on these issues. You're working on these issues precisely to try and find some of these sorts of measures or ways of studying these disintegrative effects. And I also think that this is something that is fairly obvious to anyone that's doing comparative research, in a sense. The comparative research very easily reveals the kind of national frames that end up kind of dominating a lot of immigrant and integration research, even when it's not really focused on the nation building dynamics of integration. And these kinds of issues of policy implicated research, where national level researchers are trying to square their critical research training to these impact demands that we get sucked into as we do our research. So a conference such as this, I think, is very helpfully foregrounding the reflexivity that we need. I think it can be very generative. I obviously think that we should also be doing this kind of reflexive comparative policy analysis. I know Peter Scolton, who's here, has been doing this kind of work for years. And, I think the contribution here should be, continue to sort of think about the analysis of comparative policy approaches and the way in which policy research is part of the construction of these sorts of frameworks. But I do think, insofar as we want to be autonomous and critical scholars, I do think that there is a sort of sense in which we need to reboot our migration theories, and that's kind of what I've been suggesting, I hope, with some of my ideas today. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adrian. How can we become less nationalist, Adrian?
That's a question.
Yeah, it's a question, because you said it actually, there's like nationalism, nation branding, British values, national values, etc. But I mean, for me, it's a question to myself as well. How can we become less nationalist?
Well, I think there's a lot of value in this kind of critical attempt to formulate what I would think of as a kind of political demography. I mean, a sort of sense in which we continue to think about how our ideas of immigration, integration, and citizenship, which structure and underpin the dominant kind of political legitimacy of liberal democracies, that there is a value, I think, in trying to kind of continue to try and expose how that works in a certain sense. So here I'm trying to make a case for a critical migration studies. I'm building on lots of recent work, I think, that is doing this sort of thing, and thinking about that in relation perhaps to both the practical kind of policy building type of work, but also I think a lot of the work that has tried to operationalize immigrant integration type research. And I do fundamentally think that we underestimate the powers of academic work in structuring a lot of the political debate. I do think academics have had a very big influence and do influence this broader kind of national discussion that is going on. We're not just reflecting it. I would you know, I suppose part of what I'm also saying is that I think there were resources out there in the 1990s that continue to be relevant. And I think debates within the transnationalism literature, the mobilities literature, and debates about post-national issues of post-national society continue to be relevant. And we've kind of lost sight of those a bit. We've lost sight of those partly because the dominant discourses have shifted so strongly back towards integration and kind of national citizenship as the kind of the only real progressive option left on the table. And partly also, I think, because a lot of the decolonial scholarship has come back in, the decolonial critical race theory type scholarship has come back in, but also kind of steamrolled over in some sense a lot of the 1990s literature, and you know, is not necessarily engaging with it. We have to think about, you know, issues. I'm also suggesting that integration scholars need to be thinking about development issues and issues about sending societies still, so that the transnational, you know, the basic issues in transnational scholarship are still, I think, fundamental to integration research in a way.
That's great. Thank you very much, and thank you for raising an interest in scholarship from 1990s as well. I think there's a lot of food for thought there. Thank you. And any questions to Adrian? Yes, please, John. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Umut. And thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I think you make a very powerful critique, and it's influenced my own work and my own approach to the things that I'll be talking about later in the afternoon, trying to address some of those critiques. But I guess, you know, it was one thing that I noticed in what you were presenting was that you made some early choices that sort of cut off other avenues or ways of thinking about integration and whatnot. And the first of those, and the most fundamental one, and the one that I struggle with probably, is the Durkheimian one. I mean, you just sort of lay it on the line that, you know, integration has to be understood in these Durkheimian terms. And you know, I guess I'm on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to that, but I just have to ask, is there an opening to go beyond that? And the reason people like Jenny and others here at the conference are pushing on these things is because they're hoping for an audience with the people who are in charge of working on questions of integration. And so, you know, I mean, I don't think, you know, so it's this categories of practice and analysis again, and it's blurring those boundaries, and you're very protective of the academic boundaries, the analytical boundaries, the robustness of the approaches that we develop and whatnot. But the whole reason to kind of move beyond that is one, driven by pragmatism, but also just, you know, I don't know, you know, does Durkheim get the last word on integration? Can we reconceive? Can we develop a new understanding, perhaps with some kind of, you know, reference to Durkheim, but still thinking in other terms about integration? So, because when you do that, there's a path dependency to everything you say. So you start with that kind of laying down the rules, got to start with Durkheim, and it's going to then take us in this direction. The next step in your path is the kind of reframe or thinking about integration in terms of this interculturalism. And, you know, I think this is why your critique is so powerful, because I think this is the most problematic aspect of integration. However, I don't see it as the only aspect of integration. I mean, there was a nod to employment, but then you kind of, you know, did the 3D thing and moved beyond that or something. But I mean, you know, look at the stuff that was in Jenny's presentation yesterday. There's a lot going on there that isn't wholly about, or even mostly about interculturalism. So I think your critique works because you've separated out this one dominant, or at least, you know, historically dominant feature of integration, and you've picked it apart. And I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying about that. But again, it seems to me, as you move forward, you're narrowing our understanding of integration. It's a very kind of specific focus on that. I mean, in some cases, expanding it because it's national, it's global, it's transnational, it's all these things. But conceptually, it seems to get narrowed. And so a lot of the work that I see coming out in the presentations the last couple of days, and in Jenny's work, and in the stuff that's been going on here, doesn't really fit with your critiqued version of integration. So I guess my question to you is, do we have to have this narrow definition of integration, or can we open things up? Can we move beyond Durkheim? Can we do things both conceptually and empirically that take us beyond this kind of narrow definition? Because that's where we're going to ultimately get the leverage in working with policymakers on these sorts of questions. If we get stuck in this thing, it's a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac, what you're describing. I mean, we're not, that's exactly the thing none of us want to be complicit in, or at least I don't want to be complicit in.
Sure.
But what I want to do is shift things and say, okay, don't talk about it this way, don't think about it this way, think about it a different way. And your version isn't really giving me space.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I get space at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, there's too much for me to gauge without sort of a book length response to this question as such. But I think it's important to note what I'm trying to do here is bring together an understanding about the long term kind of influence of a Durkheimian type of paradigm with current debates in the kind of critical race decolonial kind of paradigm, which of course are also critiquing what is ultimately a kind of modern development paradigm, effectively. So, I think you're giving the impression that I'm trying to defend a kind of Durkheimian functionalist way of looking at society. What I'm actually doing is trying to show the pervasive influence of Kantian thought translated into Durkheim, which then gets translated into the modern developmentalist paradigm, which we have the critique of, Foucault is effectively, it's Foucault where I'm kind of sitting in some sense in a paradigmatic sense, which is where everybody is in terms of critical theory. You kind of look at the kinds of things that are being written, and that the irony is in some sense that all of our integration debates are still reproducing the problems of developmentalist thinking of the 1950s, and we're stuck with this because we are stuck with a particular sort of emancipatory vision of individuals that gets blurred with ideas of national citizenship, effectively. Now that's the kind of framework that I'm working in, and I'm trying to push towards. Well, as I was suggesting, I think there are lots of resources still to be considered in the transnationalism and development literature of the 1990s, which was at least beginning to kind of try to talk about how mobilities and migration can impact the world order of global inequality in some sense, which is embedded in our hierarchies of nationality that are that are reflected in the the centrality of countries like the UK and France and so forth in a certain sort of order of things. I'm trying to kind of continue to argue about the ways in which British power is generated in the world out of diversity, out of immigration, and the ways in which it tries to process this through an ongoing iteration, in some sense, of the integration model. And I think I think there is something to be developed out of this idea of this again, it's an old insistence that we should not be focusing on consensus, but rather focusing on conflict in society and focusing on the disintegrative features of what we're studying, how it disintegrates and messes up society rather than how it's building society. And of course, if we're engaging in the business of rebuilding society for the politicians, we're in a difficult position to do that kind of work. But I do think there's a certain urgency as well to what I'm doing, because I think the integrationist model has come back with such a force with the Johnsonian politics of the moment, and the Johnsonian politics of the moment is not only a politics of national integration that celebrates diversity and supposedly levels up the mythical working classes and so forth internally, but is also a politics of reasserting national power on an empire scale globally. So there's important ways, I think, in which my my position also reflects the real dangers of a disintegrating post-national environment in which we are defaulting back to renationalization as the only option, and I just continue to find it really problematic that a lot of scholars are willing to kind of locate themselves in a kind of okay, we've got to go with this, so let's make the best of it, and let's continue to develop our ideas of multicultural nationalism or whatever as a kind of solution, or interculturalist models and so forth as a solution, as the best that we can do in a sense, rather than sort of seeing some of these other dynamics at work.
All right, there are a few questions here. I think I'm going to have
collect some comments.
Collect the questions. I have one question as well. You're talking a lot about like macro instruments of integration, in terms of, I mean, we reflected on policy documents, etc. But there's also micro elements of integrations which are embedded in rather informalities. For example, when I first moved here, I was presented with what Glaswegians eat and what Glaswegians drink. And I was told by my colleagues that now that you're here, you should be drinking iron brew and you should be consuming this kind of bread. But I understand that this is like a way of building conviviality, but nonetheless, there's a certain informal expectation as well. Like, this is how you have to live from now on, because now that you're living here, etc. So I suppose there's a pressure which is embedded in very everyday as well to integrate. So it's not only the politicians, who is making us, like academics or other instruments to demand integration, but another way of assimilation is practically what we come across in every day. So I was wondering actually how you would. We don't hear you, Adrian.
So it's who the question is, who is actually subject to those pressures? I mean, I'm trying.
Oh, the newcomer.
Yeah, but not all newcomers are. That's the point. And we have a lot of people in our society who can be in the society without ever needing to worry about that kind of issue, and that's what exposes the inequality that is going on with the integration process in some sense.
I mean, for example, I don't know.
The free movers don't need to, in other words.
I'm not that sure about that, actually. I mean, perhaps you're talking about the class element here, and at a certain class they wouldn't really be presented with this, whatever. But I mean, there would be other ways of establishing conviviality with the newcomer. For example, when I lived in Hungary, the issue was like, what do you think about Hungarian women? So that was how they were establishing a conviviality. But in that sense, in Hungary, we appreciate our women, and hence now that you're here, you have to appreciate women. These kind of things. Anyways, I'd like to give Kezi, because I see that her hand is out there.
Thanks, Adrian, for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I was really happy to support your critique, not least because I think critique is pragmatic. If you can develop new analytical categories, then they can be persuasive to policymakers and people who are on the ground having to make decisions very quickly. So but the critique didn't, I was with you with the critique, but what actually I found very interesting is at one point in your talk, you said, ideally we should be post-national. And actually that interested me. So the critique I accepted, but the idealism, I was wondering if you could maybe explain why ideally we should be post-national.
Are we going to take a few more comments? I know I can wrap up.
Yeah, let's do that. I mean, Jacqui, she has a question as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Jacqui. Good morning.
Morning. Yes, I also really enjoyed the talk. My question was in relation to the interculturalism at the local level. I was really interested to hear the kind of UK policy landscape described as resurgent. My experience would be that it's in contrast, the kind of dynamic conversations happening within academia, it's actually incredibly moribund. I mean, you could fit the people at local government level dedicated to integration work, in a not very large room, socially distanced. And well, I guess my question is, from your critique of integration, would you describe that as a good thing, in the sense that this isn't something that should be encouraged really as a policy area to develop? But I just wondered, because the sense from your talk about kind of Casey as this animating document for local government is not something that I see. I see essentially a policy area that's not very well thought about, that there is a lot of animation around migration, including at the local level, but where local government has no power, but very little animation around integration.
Thank you, Jacqui. Any other questions to Adrian? Right. Okay, Adrian, would you like to wrap up the discussion after these questions?
Yeah, thank you to Jacqui and Kezi for this. Yeah, just on that latter question. Yeah, I mean, it's a field that I've only been involved in the last few years with doing the Northern Exposure project, and you know, and in the line of the kind of work that Hannah Jones, for example, was doing on these questions of, you know, how cohesion and inclusion and multicultural questions are being discussed and reframed. You know, I think what we were struck by with our studies of these northern localities, we're looking at different sorts of local authorities in the north, was the ongoing, you know, the ongoing presence of a quite strong interest within these authorities for these sorts of issues, and a struggle to kind of continually to continue to talk about these things in ways that were locally relevant and sensitive to the changing complexities of local diversity, and the you know, the kind of both the presence of Black British minority ethnic populations and new migration populations, and new worker populations, you know, sort of European migrant population, in the context where we've got this national discourse about the North in terms of white working classes and you know, kind of cliches of post-industrial society and so forth that have become so present in the national kind of level discourse. So yeah, so I'm surprised, yeah, surprised in a sense to think that there isn't a debate around this, but Casey kind of gets referred to, it's both problematized and or referred to as something that that everybody thinks is a basic kind of reference point, but maybe things have shifted and moved on a bit from the, you know, that kind of focus on Islamic radicalization and marginalization of you know, parts of the Muslim community and so forth, that was such an obsession like 5 years ago. I mean, I think things have moved on substantially from there. And I think, yeah, the post-national thing, it's a bit, yeah, it's too glib for me to say that ideally we should be post-national. I suppose what I was wanting to say by that was that I think we all understand the critique of the nation state, or the, you know, the critique of methodological nationalism. I don't think anybody here is not on board with a critique of methodological nationalism. And I do think that there are still resources in the ways in which post-national rights were studied in the 1990s. I've always tried to argue that you know, despite the obvious Eurocentricity of European free movement rights, something interesting was going on with freedom of movement in Europe that could have global implications for arguments about free movement on a global scale. That it isn't just about building the European fortress, for example. That you know, I do think that you know, I'm very much in the line of work that came out of Yasmin Soysal's work on post-national membership, and that we continue to need to look for those sorts of you know, the identification of the power or status of non-nationals in our societies as an indicator, in some sense, of the disintegration of the national, and ways in which we can kind of still study that while being aware of the ways in which you know, that you know, a lot of the a lot of the critique of transnationalism and post-national membership as forms of neoliberalism are valid. We need to kind of take on board those points, but then look again at I think what was being done with the transnationalism and post-national literatures, because I don't see, I think we have to kind of avoid the default that is going on, which is a kind of return to the nation state context as the only kind of context in which we can develop progressive ideas effectively about diversity or inclusion. So I hope that hints at least at some of the ways in which I've been trying to develop a response to some of these very difficult questions.
Adrian, heartfelt thanks. This was great. We had a fantastic morning here. I hope the rest enjoyed as well. So thank you.